Okay, so let me introduce our first author. Derek B. Miller is an American novelist and international affairs professional. He is the author of 6 novels: Norwegian by Night, The Girl in Green, American by Day, Radio Life, the audio original novel Quiet Time, and most recently, How to Find Your Way in the Dark, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in 2 categories last year, and just won the Association of Jewish Libraries Fiction Award. So Mazel Tov, that's great. His work has won a Crime Writers Association Dagger and the Goldsboro Last Laugh Award. His work has been nominated for or shortlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger twice, the Strand Magazine Critics Award for Best First Novel, the American Booksellers Association's Indie Choice Award, Barry Award for Best First Novel, and the McCavity Award for Best First Mystery, among others. That's a lot of awards. Miller is a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College for his BA, Georgetown for his MA, and he earned his PhD summa cum laude in international relations from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, with postgraduate work at Linacre College at Oxford. He has lived abroad for over 25 years in Israel, the United Kingdom, Hungary, Switzerland, Norway, and today he's coming to us from Spain. So Derek, please take it away. I'll spotlight you now.
Hi, that's a big introduction. I'm not sure how to follow it. I haven't done sort of 15 minutes before. There's an Andy Warhol-esque quality to it. So I'm going to push the start so I don't overrun. And I think that it would just be fun. I found a sort of a scene from the latest novel, How to Find Your Way in the Dark, that sort of, I thought it'd be fun to read that would fit into this slot. And I thought I'd just sort of set the scene. I wrote Norwegian by Night about 10 years ago, and it featured an 82-year-old man named Sheldon Horowitz, who was a Korean War vet, American, who had gone to Norway to live with his granddaughter Rhea after Sheldon's wife died. And it was a big family drama, chase through the woods thriller, and it was sort of Sheldon's final adventure. So I decided more recently to return to him and look at his early life, his coming of age story, as it were, set between roughly 1938 and 1948, maybe 37 and 47 is probably more accurate. And it all takes place, he's from Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires. After his parents die, which you find out about in the first chapter, he's taken in by his family in Hartford, Connecticut. So the scene that I'm reading to you is he's now moved into this family, and he is with his older cousins, Abe, who is 17 in high school, whom he idolizes, and his cousin Mirabelle, who is about 16, who for him is a movie star, and he's slightly in love with her. Sheldon is 12. So Abe has had a rough time recently. He's been beat up, though he gave as good as he got, and now he's very angry. And he knows one of the kids who did it, and he knows that his father owns a pawn shop in Hartford, and he has talked Mirabelle and Sheldon into going to rob it. So we are going to read the scene where they go and rob the pawn shop. It is 1938, Hartford, Connecticut. And Sheldon had never been inside a pawn shop before. He'd seen the outsides. He'd even stared at this one before when walking past. It was located in the first floor of a 3-story building. There were 2 large display windows on either side of the black door. Above the windows, painted by hand, were "We buy old gold, silver, and platinum, and diamonds, watches and jewelry appraised. 100,000 used tools for all trades, expert watch and jewelry repair, a complete stock of shotguns, rifles, ammunition, fishing rods, and reels, bought, sold, and exchanged." The one that had caught Sheldon's eye, though, was the last sign over the guitars in the window. In the back of the corridor inside the shop, this is what he wanted to ask Abe about. It says accordion lessons are given here, he whispered. What? Said Abe. Accordion lessons. You can take accordion lessons here. So what? Well, isn't that weird? I don't know, is it? I think it's weird anyone wants to take an accordion lesson at all, said Sheldon, trying to keep his voice down. I guess. Abe was leading, Sheldon was in the middle, and Mirabelle was behind. This isn't important, Sheldon. And if you're going to take accordion lessons, continued Sheldon, undeterred by the lack of interest, why would you do it at a pawn shop? They're not really set up for that sort of thing, you know? I mean, who wants to go shopping for a watch or a trumpet and listen to some doofus learning the accordion in the corner? They entered into the back office where Teddy McCullen sat day after day, buying stolen items from drunks and junkies and running book on sporting events. His chair was a high steel one made of raw naga hide with a crack in the middle and a permanent double dimple. It faced a high counter for talking to people on the other side. There was no glass, no chicken wire. The desk was littered with newspapers and books, staples and tape, a green banker's lamp, off now, and a snow globe with a terminal tower inside. Written across the bottom was, I'd rather be in Cleveland. Why would anyone rather be in Cleveland? Sheldon whispered. Mirabelle had lifted the partition to the main room and was starting to place objects in her laundry bag as quietly as possible. She looked focused, discerning, and happy. No one would rather be in Cleveland, Abe said, trying to shut Sheldon up by answering his questions for a change. Abe, though, didn't know his cousin well enough to know that answers only helped Sheldon further refine his questions. Abe checked the register for cash and found none. He squatted down and started running his hands beneath the counter looking for keys. It's just weird, Sheldon whispered. The only place you'd buy a snow globe at Cleveland would be Cleveland. And if you're already in Cleveland, you wouldn't buy a snow globe saying you'd rather be in Cleveland because you'd already be there. They're gifts for out-of-town friends, Sheldon. They're tourist kitsch. Abe found 2 sets of keys, which he hoped would open the cabinets of the jewelry and watches. He palmed them carefully and stood up. But if nobody would rather be there, okay, you know who'd rather be in Cleveland? Jews in Germany and Italy and Poland and Europe in general. They'd rather be in Cleveland. Sheldon hadn't thought to go international. I really need you to focus on stealing, okay? Abe said, trying desperately to shut Sheldon up. The accordion lessons don't matter. The snow globe doesn't matter. And if you even think of taking that snow globe, I will make you eat it. Are we clear? Sheldon nodded while taking the snow globe and placing it gently into his empty laundry sack. Mirabelle had jimmied the lock on the watch display and was now snatching them up by the handful and dropping them into her bag. Abe opened a display cabinet filled with shotguns and old pistols. He removed a revolver with wooden handles and held it up. You're heavy, Abe said to the gun. It's a Colt 1917 from the war, Sheldon said, glancing at it. My dad came home with one. He traded in for some traps we used for the bobcats. You should see if it's loaded. Sheldon showed Abe how to pull back on the cylinder release. Yeah, it's loaded, said Sheldon. Be careful, okay? It's a double action, so pulling the trigger will make the gun shoot even if the hammer isn't pulled back. You really know a lot about these things. Your Underwood typewriter is more complicated than a gun, Abe. Sheldon and Abe both heard footsteps and looked over at Mirabelle to see what she was up to. Alone with her wealth of distractions, she'd wrapped a flapper's purple boa over her shoulders and was holding a nickel-plated trumpet over a black case lined with plush green felt. That was when they heard the unspeakable pump of a shotgun accompanied by footsteps on creaky stairs on the far end of the office behind a door. Where does Mr. McCullen live? Sheldon asked. Is it possible that he lives upstairs, which is where he teaches the accordion lessons? Because all of a sudden that would make a lot of sense and prove that my question was. The door started to open. Mirabelle might have looked like she was in her own world, but she was the first to take action. She dropped the trumpet, grabbed her bag, and hurled herself towards the exit with the speed of a ferret. Sheldon, unlike his clever cousin, was frozen in place as he watched Mirabelle run, but his paralysis ended when Abe squeezed off a round from the Colt that shattered a Baroque mirror on the far wall. The crash of the falling glass snapped him back, and Sheldon bolted after Mirabelle into the dark corner, under the bell that dangled like mistletoe, and out to the alley where they'd come in. Behind him, Sheldon heard a shotgun blast, followed by the pump chambering of a second shell, but he didn't have long to wonder whether Abe was all right, because that second Abe's hand grasped his collar and yanked him out to the alley. Faster, Abe yelled, as though he could command Sheldon's legs to grow. Mirabelle's purple boa was lying up ahead, discarded in the gray street like an exotic snake, and she was already 50 yards further on, running as fast as a track star with her bag clenched to her chest. A shadow, she disappeared into a side street as Abe pulled Sheldon the opposite direction. They sprinted together along the sidewalk, keeping their heads low in case Mr. McCullen had a mind and a chance to shoot them off. All right.
You still have a few more minutes, so yeah.
Okay,
talk.
so what should I talk about? I think what I want to, if you don't know, okay, I'm asked, if you haven't read either one, where should you start? And what I found, which isn't it, I will answer it, I guess, but what was very interesting about writing this was I've never, as a writer, as it were, is the effort to take a character and a reasonably well-known character who's 82 years old and try to regress that character back to someone who is, a teenager, a preteen, 12-year-old, 15-year-old, because it evokes big sort of philosophical questions like, what is the nature of the self, as it were, and how much of ourselves is still recognizable, from 15 to 82, and how much of the voice remains, how much of the sort of the character, the personality, and can I get across to a reader that you are in fact reading the same person. And I think one of the greatest experiences for me was going on that journey of extracting out, sort of finding the essence of somebody who would eventually become, this extremely experienced, broad, big American character, and trying to find the core and essence of him. And then watching him grow over a decade during, obviously, one of the most tumultuous periods, in history, and certainly the core of the 20th century. And I'm left with, this odd relationship with the books, because of course I wrote him as an old man first, and more recently I read him, as it were, as a child. And so my experience is coming at all of this from Norwegian by Night first, and then going back to How to Find Your Way in the Dark. And so from a chronological point of view, watching a life unfold, I think starting with Sheldon Young and moving to old, in a sense, is probably where I'd begin if you're unfamiliar with the books. But if you've read Norwegian by Night first, there are certain, I'm aware that many people will have done that. And so as I was writing it, I was very conscious of the connections, the formative experiences, the formative, even the impressions that sometimes take decades in order to realize and materialize as action or behavior or philosophies or approaches to life, or the errors that end up defining us, errors of interpretation, errors of understanding, but that we hold on to in order to give some structure and form to who we are. And so the approach to this also there are also different kinds of books, because one of them is set over, How to Find Your Way in the Dark is set over 10 years, whereas Norwegian by Night which is more of a chase through the woods thriller, is set, while it spans from the Korean War all the way, to I think 2008. It's mostly compacted into a week and a half. So it's a tighter, book in the sense of being more like a traditional thriller, I guess. And that's where I am now. And I've just finished another novel, which I'm just finalizing these things now, which is the working title is The Curse of Pietro Houdini. And that is set in Italy around the bombing of the Abbey of Monte Cassino in 43 and 44. And so that is, that's next out. And those who have access to the UK and the Commonwealth, in between the two, I wrote Radio Life, which was a science fiction, sort of a post-apocalyptic science fiction epic, but it's about a civilization's on the rise rather than anything that's I would think of as dystopian. I don't think it's a post-apocalyptic, but not dystopian, if that makes any sense. And so, yeah, in the absence of another voice to work off of, I think I'm going to end there. So, but thanks for the time, and I look forward to your questions and chat at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. And I also, well, I've read How to Find Your Way in the Dark first, and now I'm on to Norwegian by Night, but I'm listening to them. And so it was a little jarring for me to all of a sudden have a new narrator for Norwegian by Night, aside from the fact that now Sheldon is 82. But yes, as Erica put in the chat, that is also my experience of writing an 82-year-old man first and then going backwards. But okay, I'm going to introduce our next author. When did I unmute you, Ben? Oh, ask you. Okay. Ben Sharafski is an Israeli-Australian writer who lives in Sydney's northern beaches. His new book, which I have here because I read the paperback, Returning to Carthage, explores in a series of interlinked stories love, loss, and everything in between. So Ben, why don't you take it away, and I'm going to spotlight you. You're still muted, though. Hold on. Wait. One sec. Ask to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Great. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Here in Sydney, it's 5 a.m. on Monday morning, so I haven't had my second coffee yet. So if I'm not totally coherent, please bear with me. Now, first, I'd like to thank Julie Zuckerman for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me to take part. And I would also like to congratulate my fellow panelists, Pamela Braun Cohen and Derek B. Miller, on the recent publication of their books. And I'm pleased and honored to be included today in such accomplished company. Now, Julie's asked me to tell you a little bit about the origins of my book and about my creative process. As a kid, I used to be a total bookworm, and I'd read anything I could lay my hands on. I'd read my mother's cookbooks, the classified section in the newspaper, and of course, any book I could lay my hands on. I remember once I found a copy of the Hebrew edition of To Kill a Mockingbird on my mum's bookshelf, and I started reading it. And if you recall, in the beginning, it's innocuous enough, because there's this description of Scout and her elder brother Jem playing in the front yard, and they find in the knothole of an old tree 2 little dolls carved of bars of soap. And I was totally enthralled by this description of the serendipitous discovery and drawn into the book. But after reading about 50 or 60 pages, the book suddenly disappeared, completely vanished from view. And I looked for it everywhere, but couldn't find it. And only years later, I found out that my mother, thinking that the rest of the storyline wasn't quite suitable for an 8-year-old, had hidden it away from me. Now, as a total bookworm, it's hardly surprising that I also aspired to become a writer. And indeed, I had this inner conviction that writing was my calling. I had this certainty that one day I would write and publish my books. But then years had gone by. I moved to Australia, finished my university studies, embarked on a career that had nothing to do with writing, and got married, and I wasn't writing anything. And there's a famous quote by Peter de Vries, who used to be a writer and editor for the New Yorker. And it goes, "I love being a writer. What I don't like is all the paperwork." And I was just like that. I wanted to be a writer, but the thought of sitting down and facing a blank sheet of paper or an empty computer screen was just too daunting. And I used to berate myself for being lazy, for lacking commitment and concentration, for getting so easily distracted by everything that life had to throw at me. But I think my non-writing had a deeper cause, because my tastes in literature ranged to literary fiction. And I used to read books by Chekhov, Isaac Babel, Stendhal, Calvino, John Updike and the like. And I just didn't have the confidence, or perhaps the audacity or the naivety, to think that anything that I could produce would be worthy of standing on a bookshelf next to those great masterpieces by these celebrated writers. And then my first child, my daughter, was born. And that was during the time of the Second Palestinian Uprising, where there was this spate of horrible suicide bombings all over Israel, in cafes and restaurants and buses, etc. And every year I used to go back home, go to visit Israel to see my parents and my family. Initially, I'd do it by myself, and then, of course, with my wife. And it would be a routine exercise, almost on autopilot, without devoting to the operation too much thinking. And yet this time, when I was due to visit Israel for the first time with my daughter, I was suddenly gripped with fear. And in a parallel development, I developed at the time a somewhat esoteric interest. I started collecting ancient coins, focusing on the coins of the ancient city of Carthage. Carthage was a Phoenician colony in North Africa that's grown to become Rome's arch enemy. And you probably all remember the scene of Hannibal, the Carthaginian, crossing the Alps with his war elephants. One day I received by mail, now an armchair psychologist might say that my sudden interest in ancient coins was due to the fact that, faced with my own mortality following the birth of my daughter, I was seeking to extend myself back in time by owning these ancient artifacts. Now, one day I received by mail a coin I had purchased from an Italian coin dealer, and I handled it carelessly, and consequently it developed bronze disease. Bronze disease is a case where a bronze coin starts oxidizing, and then all these ugly, bright green spots start popping up on its surface, and eventually totally disfiguring it. And I was very disappointed in myself that this beautiful ancient artifact that had survived for 2,000 years almost intact got damaged beyond repair during its first couple of days under my custody. Now, the night after that incident, I had a shocking nightmare. I was holding this ancient coin in my hand, and it started melting and creating a hole in my hand and threatening to swallow everything. And I woke up in a fright, my heart thumping, my body shaking, and I was simply astonished by the intensity of my emotions. How could a small artifact create such intensity within me? And of course, the answer to that question was that the dream wasn't about the coin. The dream was about my daughter and about my fear that something might happen to her if I took her with me to Israel. And then I was tormented by this issue for a period of time until I finally understood that this torment wasn't necessarily about Palestinian suicide bombings, but it was due to a more universal issue. Because like every new parent, I was learning a universal lesson that with my growing love to my child, I was literally placing a hostage at the hands of destiny, and that situation would last for as long as I live. And then I had another insight, and that was there's the kernel of a story here. And I started jotting down jumbled notes, a phrase here and a few bullet points there. And I ended up accumulating 5 or 6 pages of rough notes. But with work and family and social commitments, I just never had the peace and the concentration required for sitting down and producing a cohesive, coherent, structured, well-written story. And then finally, in desperation, I flew by myself to Bali, and I went to Ubud, which is a small village in the mountains, surrounded by lush green rice terraces and coconut trees. And I stayed there at a small family hotel that's owned by descendants of the royal family of Ubud. A tiny hotel with 6 rooms facing a little pool surrounded by tropical vegetation with metallic colored sunbirds flying between the branches and butterflies fluttering around and incense burning in every little corner of the garden. And there I finally found the concentration and the peace required to write my first story. And that story was accepted for publication in Quadrant magazine, whose literary editor was at the time Les Murray, who was the most eminent poet in Australia in the past few decades. And not only he accepted it for publication, but he also praised it. And I felt that by doing so, he was co-opting me into the guild of writers. And I was finally turned from a writer who doesn't write to a writer who actually writes and publishes his work. Now, that got me thinking, why do I write? Why do I feel this urge to add my output to all those amazing masterpieces out there? And my answer to that was that I'm not a master stylist of the English language by any stretch of the imagination. I do not conduct in my writing any bold experiments in form. And the themes I deal with, love, loss, family bonds, betrayal, these are universal themes that have been dealt with since the dawn of writing, since the cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia. So why do I write? I write because each one of us leads a unique life, a never to be repeated experience. And each one of us has experiences and insights and complex emotions that will never be repeated. And if I did not record this never to be repeated lifetime of experiences, then no one else would. So how are we going for time? Do we have time for a short reading, or?
You have, I guess, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes left, I think.
Okay, what if I read a couple of pages? Just one sec, please.
Sure. Okay. I like your message, though, to everybody on the call, everybody listening in, that everybody should take up the pen, because everybody has a unique life experience and needs to record that.
Yeah, I think as long as a piece of writing is authentic, it has value, you know, regardless of what it actually contains. Let me just find the page.
Sure.
Okay, I'm reading here at the beginning of the title story in my collection, Returning to Carthage. It is a warm, slightly overcast Saturday on the foreshore of Narrabeen Lagoon in Sydney's northern beaches. A mother and her 2-year-old son are standing at the water's edge, feeding pieces of stale tip-top bread to the throng of ducks gathered around them. A lone pelican floats at a safe distance, apparently undecided whether to join in the fray. Atop a tropical tree, whose name I do not know, 3 rainbow lorikeets screech, feeding on the bright red berry-like fruit that is now in season. On the footpath, a 10-year-old girl proceeds gingerly on her brand new rollerblades, trying not to bump into a couple of retirees, while walking an ugly-faced yet pleasant-looking Staffordshire Terrier. Holding my 18-month-old daughter Sophie in my arms, I undo the childproof latch of the security gate and place her on the synthetic rubber-covered ground. She runs at once towards the swing. I follow her, lift her up, and put her feet through the 2 round holes at the bottom of the soft plastic seat. I then buckle up the safety chain across the front. Push, Sophie says. It is one of the few words she has already mastered. When I push, she starts giggling with pleasure. Half an hour later, an elevator music rendition of Greensleeves wafts into the air. Let's go get an ice cream, I say, and lift Sophie up into my arms. We walk towards the old Bedford van, which has been repainted pink with a paintbrush. I order a choc top, and Sophie watches with wonder how the balding, overweight, middle-aged man can take a cone in his hand, press a lever, and make a flow of white semi-liquid come out. He then dips the cone in a warm brown liquid, which hardens instantaneously. I pay, and we walk back towards the playground, which has become almost deserted. The sky has darkened within the last few minutes, and I can see people getting hurriedly into their cars. The first drop of rain hits the bridge of my nose. After looking around for shelter, I sit on a bed of fallen needles under a pine tree, which would give us at least some protection from the drizzle. Sophie sits on my lap, cocooned in my arms. I bite off the tip of the chocolate icing and let her taste the vanilla ice cream. For a fraction of a second, she is taken aback by the coldness. But once it has melted in her mouth, it appears that she cannot believe her luck. Such sumptuous sweetness, such smoothness, the subtle flavor of vanilla. These things are beyond anything she could have imagined prior to this moment. And how many more wonders, how many more discoveries are still ahead of her?
Thank you so much, Ben. And right after that, I know you get to the part about the mother in Tel Aviv, but we're gonna stop. I'm gonna stop you here because we want to get to our third author. So let me add Pam's spotlight here while I introduce her. Hold on. Haunted by the legacy of the Holocaust, Pamela Braun Cohen became an activist in the Soviet Jewry movement in the early 1970s. She served as co-chair of Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry from 1978 until 1986, when she became the national president of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews, UCSJ. Her leadership role took her to the halls of Congress and the White House and on frequent trips to the Soviet Union. Cohen received the Humanitarian Award from the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of Chicago, the Medal of Honor from Refuseniks, and a Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Spertus College of Judaica. She now lives in Jerusalem with her husband, Leonard, although right now she's speaking to us from Chicago, where she splits her time. So take it away, Pam.
Thank you, Julie. It's really an honor for me to be on this program, especially with such distinguished writers, Ben and Derek. So thank you for having me. I wrote the book Hidden Heroes, one woman's story of resistance and rescue in the Soviet Union, because I was obsessed with the fact that we today don't know really the history of what happened in the Soviet Union to create really the largest rescue of Jews in modern history. The names of what I called hidden heroes, men and women who applied to immigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel, and their moral courage is certainly not known by most adults, and certainly not by our children, the next generation. Very often we conflate the Russian immigration to the French immigration, the American, Australian. Now we're seeing a little bit of a difference because of the Ukrainian crisis. But before that, we really saw them very much parallel to each other. What happened in the Soviet Union was a very, very remarkable and a historic movement. And that my book is a testimony to that. What I would like to do for just a moment is to kind of paint, many of you are of the age that remembers what the Soviet Union was, an iron curtain, a vast prison of 15 republics, of which Ukraine was one, with KGB monitoring all the borders, sealed borders. Today, it's hard for us to imagine a country where there's no internet or cell phones. I mean, the last 40 years have revolutionized social media and our communication so greatly that we can't even imagine what it was to be able to make a telephone call to somebody who was under surveillance by KGB. But that's the way it was. In these 15 republics, then we estimated about 5 million Jews. We today know that there were many more than that. Living in that country, along with those 3 to 5 million Jews, were over 1 million KGB informants and agents, with a first directorate, a directorate that was assigned to watch the Jewish community. Since really the Bolshevik Revolution, but certainly increasing under Stalin, Jews were systematically purged, and living under twin policies of basically forced assimilation and state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It's just really difficult to imagine today. No Jewish bookstores, no Jewish publications, no magazines, no institutions except the state-sponsored government institution like the Moscow Synagogue, the Choral Synagogue. And in this vast prison, Jews were completely isolated from information about Israel, isolated from their people, living on basically a guarded island. They were forced to, because of the restrictions, be better than everybody else. And many of them made it to top institutions in spite of the restrictions. Even though they weren't permitted into the best universities, many of them became scientists and in various institutions. So what changed? What happened? The sea change was the 1967 war, because even while the state press was propagandizing the fact that Israel had lost the war, they were showing televised, Jews could see televised pictures of what they saw were Jewish boys in Israeli uniforms fighting for their existence. And even though the Soviets were depicting it as a massive casualties and a defeat for Israel, Jews could read between the lines. And these boys, these images conveyed a sense of dignity, understanding that we had a Jewish homeland, and there was an immediate recognition that there was something that they were attached to in a way that they couldn't yet materialize. Many of them at that point, as early as 67, some, not many, mostly from areas which had a stronger identity, like Latvia, began to apply for permission to leave, which was an extremely complicated procedure. But they were repeatedly denied permission, and a group of them decided to embark on the most selfless, it's still really, when you think about it, they decided that they were going to hijack a plane, Mesiris Nefesh, to take a plane from the Soviet Union to Sweden in order to demonstrate, to set up a flare to us in the West about what was happening to Jews in the Soviet Union. They knew immediately that there were going to be leaks, that there would be people who would know about it and would leak it to KGB. They knew that the Soviets were going to arrest them. They were willing to face prison and even perhaps the death penalty in order to embark on this incredible plan, Operation Wedding, as it was known. And many of you know, or some of you know, some of the engineers of the plan: Joseph Mendelevich, Rabbi Joseph Mendelevich, Silva Zalmanson, Edward Kernetza. But these are names that should be known in the West. They should be known to our children. And what happened was exactly what they planned. They were tried in what was known as the Leningrad trials, 2 trials that ultimately sentenced 2 of them to the death penalty, and many of them to over a decade of hard labor in prison. But at the same time, the movement was born. I was a young mother. I had happily tending 3 little kids in the Chicago suburbs when the news broadcast the hijacking. It's known as the hijacking. And as I immediately thought of what had happened during my parents' generation, what I felt was the silence that was a kind of complicity in the murder of our people in the Holocaust. And something inside me screamed, not on my watch. And I began to become an activist and to find information about what was happening in the Soviet Union and to organize groups of people to start doing political advocacy, to write letters to our congressmen, to engage the Congress, and in order to do that, to engage the Congress, we started a grassroots affiliation with tying refuseniks biographies and their cases to synagogues in our states. In order to do that required us getting information from the Soviet Union, which in the early 70s was extremely difficult. We had to organize and engineer underground systems of communication to reach refuseniks, which you'll read about in the book, how we made messenger calls, how we briefed tourists to go to meet these people, how they were forced to submit to 17 hours of briefings and learn Cyrillic language, doctors and lawyers and rabbis, anybody who could help people inside the Soviet Union and bring out documentation on cases that we could then submit to first the Congress, then the State Department, and then ultimately the White House, in order to bring the issue of Soviet Jewry onto the first the top level birders during summits and any bilateral relations with the Soviets. We used every international conference and every international venue to raise the issue of Soviet Jewry. But it wasn't an anonymous movement. What happened was at the beginning of the 70s, the information that was brought out, and certainly by people like me who went to the Soviet Union and sat in apartments and documented cases and understood what people wanted. Each family in the Soviet Union dictated how they wanted their case to be treated. We knew their names, we knew their children's names, we knew their birthdates. It wasn't hundreds, it was thousands and then 10,000s. And the movement began to grow, not only in Chicago, but ultimately we developed 54 councils throughout the United States, independent councils, not controlled by any of the governments, either the United States government or the Israeli government, not the Jewish establishment. We were directly responsible to the refuseniks, people who were who applied for permission and refused permission to immigrate. What I didn't tell you is that this process of immigration turned them into political, economic, and social pariahs. They were immediately fired from their jobs. Many of them, people like Yuli Sharafski was a refusenik for 17 years. They ate their drapes, they sold their pianos. In order to be able to live, they sold their belongings. Many of them were lucky to be able to get jobs as elevator operators or street pavers. But the stories come alive in the book. It's written. I've been told it's a page turner in many respects. And the narratives and the characters come to life in the book. And I see that we are running out of time. So I'm going to take this opportunity and read just a couple of paragraphs to give you an idea of not only what, as Sharafski has always said, the Soviet Union movement and the refuseniks did more for the people who were involved in the movement than we did for refuseniks, although it was the combined partnership, and that was one of my roles, was to make a partnership between the grassroots movement and the activists in the Soviet Union, which ultimately brought about the rescue of the largest Jewish community in history. But looking back, I often wonder about my past self, that young girl with her unanswered questions, her love of Jewish books, and a reluctance to speak publicly. I do remember the young mother, happy to be home with her 3 small children, cooking something wonderfully fragrant, reading stories out loud, content with her world and her lot, not looking for change. But that contentment and complacently were buried in the rubble left by an unstoppable drive to help her people. The questioning girl, the young mother, the volunteer activist, now mitzvah observant. To me, it all seems like a miracle. Without guarantees that our choices would flower, I only had the free will to choose where to put down one foot, then another. After a few steps, I could see the beginning, but I had no idea where it would all end up. Now I am where I wanted to be all along, although I hadn't known it. Now, during this journey, I was absorbed in each moment, struggling with challenges, moving from one emergency to the next, appearing with exquisite precision exactly when I needed them, as if they were waiting for me, were inspiring refuseniks and prisoners of conscience, role models and partners, colleagues, activists, teachers, rabbis. They changed my husband and myself, and we altered our lives to accommodate those changes. And so I wanted to carry on what my great-grandparents left behind in that graveyard in Shava, Lithuania. I wanted to be a part of the continuum that all started in Sinai to carry and transmit that meaning into the future. Only in retrospect, after the Soviet Union collapsed, did I comprehend the enormity of the challenge we, our voluntary strike force, had faced. The urgency of arrests and threats, house searches and trials that demanded our first response chain of reaction, the inconceivable scope of our day-to-day activity, including messenger calls, tourist briefings, direct aid, demonstration, data collection, documentation, informing and information distribution, and the ever-expanding grassroots advocacy confronting the Soviets at international venues and conducting press conferences and government briefings. We had been witnesses to nothing less than a miracle of redemption for over 2 million Jews. We were not only witnesses, all of us, volunteers in the independent grassroots movement, had tied our lives to the lives of our people in a far-off country and had participated in what may be the only mass rescue movement of Jews in Eastern and Central Europe in our long history. Our rabbis tell us that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, was destroyed and our nation dispersed into a long and dark exile because of baseless hatred, undermining jealousy, and lashon hara, literally even evil tongue. I've come to believe that the exodus of Jews from the enormous post-Soviet landmass was a cosmic reaction to the antithesis of baseless hatred, the unifying factor of baseless love. Love between Jewish activists in the West and refuseniks, the shared worry, the shared pain, the shared burden, the shared responsibility, the shared joy that might have been a power so great as to trigger a miraculous force that not only brought out millions of Jews, but ripped apart the very structure that imprisoned them. This is the story of hidden heroes, both inside and outside the former Soviet Union. Those hidden heroes leave a priceless legacy. Life gives us freedom, freedom to choose and freedom to change. Some of us have the courage to change ourselves. Some of us can change ourselves and in the process inspire others. Some of us can change ourselves, inspire others, and in the end, change the world.
Pam, that was I'm very inspired by everything you've done and your story. I'm gonna add the spotlights, add everybody else to the spotlight here. So everybody in attendance, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And let me ask you all to unmute. Does it, in the meantime, do any of you have questions for each other? But I just want to say, Pam, that I mean, growing up in the 70s and the 80s, the Soviet Jewry movement was definitely something that was very, you know, we were part of it. We did all the, you know, walkathons, and I wore my, you know, Refuse Nick bracelet of Vladimir Slepek for a long time, and certainly remember the rally in '87 in DC. So yeah, but again, as you said, like my kids who are growing up in Israel don't really know about it. They kind of
You would have seen me. At that big demonstration with 250,000 people, I introduced Sharansky.
Oh.
So we're both there.
We were both there. I bet a lot of people that are on this call today were there. Okay, let me see. Yes. Okay. Ellen asked before about Derek's books. If you have, you have discussion questions in your books, and if they're out in paperback, I think was her question.
Am I alive here? Yes, I am. Hi. Thanks for the question. Pam, I would ask you 1,000 questions. I'm not being silent out of lack of interest. It's just that I wouldn't even know where to begin to stop. So it's just, if we run out of time, I'd be happy to throw things out there as well. And Ben, thanks for the reading. I should have voiced my thanks for being here earlier. So I'm ashamed, but I wanted to be quick. It's coming out in paperback in the United States soon. I think they're just finalizing things now. So the answer is no, it's coming soon, and that'll be out in North America. The British version is being published by Transworld, which is Penguin Random House. That's coming out in the UK and the rest of the Commonwealth in May. So if you don't have access to it, that's why. But that'll be coming out in hardback, and then I assume the Kindle comes out, you know, or the electronic one, whatever, comes out around the same time. But you won't see a UK/Commonwealth paperback for a while. So that's the answer to that. What is in the back of the paperback one? I think there's an interview with me. Which I don't remember because I've written 2 books since then. But I wrote, but I remember there being an interview. As far as a study guide, they used to produce them, but I don't think we have one now. But I think that sounds like a fun idea. I just haven't kind of done that. But if anybody wants to get in touch with me and put something like that together or anything, I'm happy to, you know, get in touch, please. Thanks.
Okay, I see a comment from my friend Diane, who was mentioning that we were at Barnard, Columbia at the time, and we bussed 100 students. In my memory, we had like 20 buses or something like that, Diane. And I actually got lost and I was like, I got separated from my friends, and I was trying to look in some big parking lot for any bus going north. You know, we're going to New Jersey, I'll get on that bus. And finally, the guy who was the head of our, what was it called? Not Hillel at the time, but CJO, I think. Anyway, he found me, and he put me on a bus going back to Columbia. But yeah, it was an incredible event that that we all remember. Pam,
I do want to just tell you that my book is available at most Steinetsky's.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think people on the call are some people in Israel, some people in North America.
And
so
for those in North America, it's available on Amazon.
Great. I wanted to ask you again, Pam, how was the experience of writing this all down? how's the experience of writing the book for you?
All consuming. It was the Soviet Jewry movement was a very complicated movement. I mean, today we look at it as the big, $250,000 people march in Washington, but it didn't start out that way. And it was very politically divisive in many respects. It's very complicated. And when the refuseniks, the leaders of the movement, really knew that to write this book required someone of courage, because I felt that they felt, and I felt for sure, that if I was going to write this book, I was going to tell the real story, what really happened, because it's a lesson for history. I think reviewers have said it's a model for future historians, for research. So I was compelled. I had all of my archives are at the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. I had my archives. Once I started writing, I just wrote for like 3-4 years. It's documented, it's footnoted. I wanted it to be not only reliant on my own memory, but I'll share one thing. After I retired from I stepped down from the national presidency after 10 years in 1996, when the gates had opened and a new kind of leadership was needed in the new republics. I wrote for 5 years, and I had a very difficult time writing about myself. I could write about the refuseniks, and I couldn't use the word I. And I became national president in 1986. So I had I had 10 years of experience. But when I began writing about taking it up again 5 years ago, I realized that I was literally one of the maybe 3 last people in the English-speaking world alive to tell the story. There was nobody left. I was standing on the shoulders of giants. And if I didn't tell the story, that story would never come out. And once I started, I just wrote. My husband kept saying, you have to stop some point. I mean, at some point I could have kept writing for years. And there are so many stories that I didn't tell. I always think of refusenik Emma Landsman in Moscow, whose story I didn't tell, who was a refusenik and whose child drowned in a bathtub. So, I mean, never getting a chance to even leave the Soviet Union. There's so many tragic stories that I could tell, and I just couldn't tell them all.
Well, I'm so glad you were able to tell what you told. Maybe you'll have a second book. But that actually brings me to another question for Derek and for Ben about the research involved. How much did you have to do research for your books? I know, Derek, I mean, there was so much detail in the, in every aspect of, the gun factory to the, Abe, the Sheldon's cousin, who later serves in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he must have had to do so much research to get all those details. And Ben, I don't know, did you have to do research also?
Yes, one running theme in my book is that historical events, and that refers to both the protagonist's personal history, his childhood in Israel, but also more remote collective history, like events in World War II Manchuria, or Russia under the Tsarist regime, or even ancient Carthage. Such remote events are still carried in the collective memory and still have repercussions on the characters in the book even today. So, of course, the sections in the book that relate to these periods entailed some research, and I guess I had to do it the way everyone else does, a combination of internet and books and printed material. And I've always had an interest in history, so it was actually one of the most enjoyable parts of working on the book.
I hear you.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm an academic by training, so my brain is structured to go after this stuff. So that wasn't really an issue. I think what was interesting for me, though, is unlike nonfiction work, which in some ways is it's purposive when you set out to try to produce some kind of understanding in the reader. You may not know what the answers are when you begin, but you embark on something in order to share a story, to make an argument, to correct an existing argument, to fill a lacunae that you feel that exists in the record. There's any number of you might have any number of impulses, but there's an understanding of why you're embarking on a nonfiction activity. And you have some sense. Again, you may not know the full journey, you may not know exactly where you're going to arrive, but you understand why you're embarking on such a thing. When you start doing a novel, you don't always know, you feel some sense of inspiration and drive, but you don't necessarily know exactly where it's going. And you're also not setting out to make a case for anything. It's a drama. So it may result in something that has sort of, to use legal language, force and effect, right? But it doesn't set out to do that, right? You're not setting out to educate. So the point is that the sort of the research comes along with its own needs at the time in order to be, depending on the author, but for me, intensely faithful to the period of time in which I'm operating. So I'm trying to do two things at the same time. One of them is I'm trying to be faithful to the period because I know that people get their history from fiction, whether it's movies or books or whatnot. We can have a long discussions about what should be and have a whole Humean discussion about the is's and oughts of the world, but the bottom line is they do. And as such, I believe, and I think this is a very Jewish audience, so I think we probably all feel this way, some profound sense of responsibility in making sure that we are communicating in ways where if people read us for history, which they shouldn't be, but we know they're going to be, we are therefore going to make sure it's the best damn history that they're going to get. I'm sure we can all figure out why we feel this incredible compulsion. And I'm just happy to chalk it up to it's a Jewish thing for the moment. One thing I would say is, though, is the way that I do it for a book like this is I read the daily newspapers. I just read the daily newspapers from 1937, 38, 39, 40. I just read, and I don't just read the New York Times. I read the Hartford Courant. I read the Fitchburg Sentinel. I read what was now called the Boston Globe. I think it was the Boston Globe Daily back at the time. So I subscribed back when I was a kid. We had to do that on microfilm and microfiche, and and what we see in all the there's always some mystery and some Stephen King thing where they're going through the microfiche. And it was definitely more exciting back then, but you can get all online now. So no matter where I am, if I was in Oslo or Spain or whatever, I subscribe to newspapers.com for $100 a year, and I have and because it is the microfiche, it is the newspaper. It isn't a collection of articles. It's just the thing. So I know how much hats cost, how much a man's pipe costs, what I'm reading, and the beauty of it is, while I am in their future, and therefore I know certain things that they don't know, right? I can also negotiate that space between my knowingness in 2022 in this case, and them in 1938, but I can also embed myself in 1938 or 1941 or whatever it is, and just live their lives by saying, so when people say, yes, but you made the argument that this, I'm like, listen, that's what they knew. How do I know it? Because I read what they read. I'm living their lives. I'm reading with, not having any conversations with anybody, admittedly, So it's not, you can only go so deep so far, but I'm reading their daily newspapers. So in my book, when I have people arguing at the dinner table about whether or not to go to war or not go to war, and it's and we haven't gone, because it's 1938, they haven't gone to war yet, the Americans anyway. Well, sorry, excuse me. It's 1941, the war has started, and I'm mixing up another scene. It's 1941, the war has started, the British are doing their thing, the Americans are not in yet because we didn't get bombed and then be declared war upon until December, which is not exactly the same thing as joining. But I would read the editorials in the newspapers, and I would read the arguments, people talking about why it is we should go or not go into war and everything else. And so I was able to pull out and sort of amalgamate some of those things in order to bring, so then I can dramatize them as dialogue or whatever the case might be. So it isn't research in this. Oh, there are times, like in some, for example, when the hell was the double mattress invented rather than a couple of twins? I don't know. I had to look it up, right? And some things you screw up. But that's the small stuff. The big stuff, the giant sweep of history, is I'm a political scientist, so I already have sort of my background education to work with, and then I have a sense of what it is I don't know and where the details might be, and then I just go get them, right? But staying in the service of the story rather than falling down the rabbit hole, which is a matter of maturity and discipline. And experience, I think, and personality. Some people can't do it. That's why they write one book a decade, but you got to fight the impulse, and otherwise you're not going to produce. But that's my answer.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I kind of enjoy going down the rabbit hole of research, but yeah, you have to know where to stop. Like most of your readers aren't going to care about. But I guess I have a follow-up question for you then, because I tend to go, like I'll start writing, and if I need a detail about something, like, I don't know, I'm writing a story about that takes place on the day of the moon landing, right? So I'm like, and a guy in the story has a camera and he wants to take a picture of everybody that they're there with. So I had to go like look up, well, what were the popular cameras, like for amateur photographers. And so then I go and look, and I find it. But or for some other more, and I got also the transcript of the broadcast, so I have like what Cronkite is actually saying on TV, and I can watch it too. But do you like, as a matter of course, were you like reading those daily newspapers and then getting ideas from them for the story, or did you have an idea of the story and then go,
It depends, because, and this is, it's what's referred to as an abductive process of reasoning. So you're moving a step forward, and having taken the action, you can now reflect on the action you've taken and ask yourself if you liked that or not, right? So in other words, I'm making this up as I'm talking, but right, it's pouring rain outside, and this woman and this man and wife have just had a fight, and the woman decides to run out of the house because she's so fed up, and she's going to go to her sister's block 3 blocks away. On the way, she's now caught in the downpour without her raincoat. So that's what you've written. But now you see that you've written that, and you're wondering, do you want a wet wife or not? Is that going to serve your needs, or should she have grabbed the raincoat on the way out the door? Would that, and you're going to ask questions about that. You're going to say, well, would that change my understanding of her frame of mind? Would that suggest a presence of mind prior to leaving a house that you don't necessarily want to communicate? You would rather have her anger be more of a driving force than her logic and capacity for forethought. So suddenly you're left as dramatically at a juncture where you want to make a choice about where you go. And so, sometimes, your first idea is the best, off you go, jump out of the airplane. Other times you're going to look at it and you're going to say, no, I'm not happy with that decision. And you're going to go back. So once I decided they're going into Colt Armory, for example, you do what a historian does, which is you reconnoiter. Right. So the reconnoiter is not really a purposive act of saying, I'm going to find out what was the most popular camera in 1969 among people who were amateurs, such was it the Pentax or the Cam or the okay, and when did they invent white focus? I can't remember. White balance, I can't remember all that, all of which you have to do. But that's different than to reconnoiter, which is to wander around in sort of the space, because the Hartford Armory, it's cold, it's very Goyish, right? It's not all the Jews working at the Hartford Armory. But then you have the then Connecticut Yankee King Arthur's Court, so Mark Twain is writing about it in the thing, and I put it on the blank so you start playing around and it becomes an act of inspiration. And that's what's different than being a historian versus being a dramatist, which is you can reconnoiter in an archive as a historian and begin to get a sense of the whole and what is worth attending to. But as a dramatist, you can go, that's awesome. I am not going to lose. That's funny. That's hilarious. I had no idea about that. That's got to go in somewhere. And as you begin to do it, this becomes a personality issue. But for me, I don't have a problem separating the wheat from the chaff. I'm happy to go. I have all this stuff in my head, and I'm going to write the scene and just see what happens. And it might be that I missed something great and something didn't make the first pass. But I'm going to go through this book 4 or 5 times by the time this thing is done. And just to end on this point, Richard Ford, who won the Pulitzer for Independence Day, not the movie. But he said the first time you write a book, a novel that is, you write it forwards, and the second time you write it backwards. And his point being, it's a bit glib, but the point being that once you've written the first draft, now you kind of know what the hell the thing's actually about. Now you can go back and write it knowing the end, and I don't believe John Irving when he says he knows the end at the beginning, because I don't believe it. I'll debate with him all, but I don't believe you can't know if you're paying attention to yourself and you're allowing yourself to surprise yourself, which to me is where the joy of the writing comes from. And I think it comes through in the reading. So I think that's partly how that historical journey takes place. I'm sorry, it's a long answer.
Oh, that's great. That was great. Okay, let me see if there's other questions. Hold on. If not, I think we'll say goodnight. I do want to announce that our next 2 events are already scheduled. On April 24th, right after Pesach, is our April event with Omer Friedlander, who's an Israeli author, although now living in the States. And his debut story collection, The Man Who Sold Air in the Holy Land, is coming out, and I've read some of his stories online and they're amazing. So, and I think the book is coming out in the next few weeks. Route to Modiin, Tunnels, and that's a graphic novel. It's our first time we're going to have a graphic novel, and she's based in Tel Aviv. And Patrick Hicks, In the Shadow of Dora, and it's a novel that actually tells the connection between the Holocaust and the Apollo space program. Very interesting. So it was something I had no idea about. And I listened to a podcast with him and then read the book. So I'll send this out to everybody tomorrow. But in case you want to get a jump on it and register tonight, there's the link. I want to thank everybody who's been with us tonight for coming, or tonight, wherever you are today, if you're in the States or Canada or Australia. I really want to thank Ben, especially for getting up so early and being with us. And Pam and Derek, it was really great to hear from all 3 of you. And I'm left feeling very inspired by all of your work and what you do. And I hope if you haven't read their books yet, please go get their books and read them. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Derek and Ben, it was really a pleasure listening to you. I'm really looking forward to reading yours.
Yeah, I'm gonna look for you guys too. So it's lovely. This has been lovely. This could go on longer, but I'd need wine. But it's lovely.
Thank you, Julie, for bringing this all together.
Okay, my pleasure. This is like my pandemic passion project, basically. I started this, I mean, I started before the pandemic, right? But then I made it a monthly thing. So I have something to look forward to every month when I wasn't going anywhere.
It's a wonderful thing you've done. You should,
So,
congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations on seeing it
And
through.
have a great afternoon or evening, wherever you're at.
Enjoy your first cup of coffee, Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Good night. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.